This Utah Democracy Project keynote address was organized on the premise that a robust and healthy and independent press is necessary for democracy. And to this end, certainly no publication in the United States serves that function more so than the New York Times. I've been reading the New York Times every single day I could get hold of one since I was in graduate school at the University of Georgia in 1990, and I think that I have learned more about the world from that one single publication than any other book that I've read in philosophy or anything else. So I have great respect for the New York Times, and I believe that it's enriched my life and improved my citizenship in the democratic process. One thing that makes the New York Times so great is the quality of the writers. And so this morning we're honored to have on campus one of these writers for the New York Times, Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April 2009. Previously, he was senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger for theatlantic.com. He is the author of Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, and the co-author of Grand New Party, How Republicans can win the working class and save the American dream. He is the film critic for the National Review. A native of New Haven, Connecticut, he now lives in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Ross Douthat.
Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And we have about, I'm told, an hour and 15 minutes, which is, you've very graciously fit me into your class schedules. So I won't keep you any longer than that. I'm hoping to talk about the future of American journalism and the future of American politics a little bit for 25 or 30 minutes. And then I just want to open it up for questions, and hopefully we can have some kind of interesting conversation about just about anything you guys want to talk about. But so first, my prepared remarks. I thought I would begin talking about the future of American journalism by talking a little bit about American journalism's distant past. And I thought I'd start with what's probably one of the most famous careers in the history of the American media, the career of H.L. Mencken, who was the great reporter and columnist and essayist who wrote for the Baltimore Sun for most of the first half of the 20th century. And today, Mencken is mainly remembered, I think, if he's remembered at all. Journalists aren't always remembered, unfortunately, for his coverage of the famous Scopes monkey trial, the evolution trial in Tennessee in the 1920s. But he was really one of the dominant figures in American journalism for decades. He wrote columns, books, literary criticism. He was friends with figures like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Theodore Dreiser, Sinclair Lewis. He founded the American Mercury magazine. He wrote a pretty extraordinary multi-volume analysis of how English is spoken in the United States. And if there's an emblematic American journalist, a kind of archetype of the skeptical, not suffering fools gladly man of the press, it's probably Mencken, the sage of Baltimore, as they called him. But I think it's important, looking back, to remember that someone like Mencken, for all his fame and influence, was never really a respectable figure in a way, never an establishment type. He was never the sort of journalist who whispered in the ears of presidents or penned chin-stroking essays on the all-important role of the press in a vibrant American democracy. Not that there's anything wrong with the idea of the press in American democracy, but he was a different kind of figure. He never graduated from college, as most journalists didn't at that time. He started his career at the Baltimore Morning Herald, a paper that was soon defunct, at the age of 19, and never acquired a degree more distinguished than a high school diploma. He reached a mass audience but made absolutely no attempt to curry favor with them. He was furiously anti-Christian at a time when America was more Christian than it is today. He idealized Friedrich Nietzsche and German culture at a time when German culture was not particularly popular in the United States. And he held American democracy, in fact, in a kind of contempt. He referred to it as the worship of jackals by jackasses, among other fairly pungent phrases. And he regarded many ordinary Americans as, boobs and morons, and said so repeatedly. He attacked FDR's New Deal in the 1930s pretty much the way Glenn Beck attacked Barack Obama. He was vehemently opposed to the Second World War, which is somewhat unimaginable today. And he was highbrow and cynical and never anything other than politically incorrect. He makes a contemporary figure as controversial as, say, Christopher Hitchens seem almost tame by comparison. Mencken died in 1948, and over the next generation or so, over the next 30 or 40 years, American journalism evolved in ways that made careers like his increasingly rare in certain ways. In Mencken's day, journalism had been a scrappy working-class profession. A generation later, most journalists had college degrees, and the press aspired to be a kind of guild with high professional standards, like law or medicine. An earlier generation of journalists would have probably found the idea of journalism graduate schools kind of ridiculous, but they became a normal part of the journalistic landscape. In Mencken's day, newspapers competed furiously for readers, often within cities. There would be 3 or 4 competing newspapers, even in mid-sized American cities. And they warred over turf, tried to outdo one another in speed and controversy, and often didn't care all that much about getting the facts exactly right. A generation later, though, most American cities had seen their diverse newspaper cultures consolidate, often into a single daily, maybe a single daily and a tabloid. Mencken's Sun became the only Baltimore newspaper in the 1980s when the evening newspaper folded. And the national press was dominated by a trio of broadcast networks, plus PBS, and a few major news magazines. And there was a sort of an ideal of objectivity that held sway basically across the whole journalistic establishment. In Mencken's day, the press had been more partisan and polemical and more truthy, to borrow Stephen Colbert's useful phrase, I think, than it was perfectly objective. Whereas a generation later, thanks to the idea of objectivity, the range of political opinions that found their way into the major newspapers and news magazines had shrunk somewhat. So a figure like Mencken, a figure as controversial, with his sympathies for German culture during World War I and so on, probably wouldn't have found a natural home on the op-ed page of a major newspaper in, say, 1975 or so, or a natural perch offering commentary on Walter Cronkite's nightly broadcasts and so on. There was still some room for that kind of eccentricity, but by and large, the American media was less of a place where a Nietzsche-admiring, democracy-hating snob could rise to enormous influence. And that's the media, I think, that most of today's Americans, my parents' generation and to some extent my grandparents' generation, grew up with. The media as establishment, which saw itself and its institutions as a permanent, sort of unchallenged part of the American landscape and regarded itself less as a business than a public trust. As in any establishment, there were natural hierarchies. The New York Times, my own newspaper, had more authority than a local newspaper. The New Yorker or a magazine like that had more authority than a partisan magazine of the left and right. The opinions of political columnists were considered very important, counted for much more than the opinions of ordinary citizens. That was a long time ago. And there were tried and true career paths and career ladders that people understood how to follow. If you wanted to work in journalism, you tried to go to a good college and work for the college newspaper, which led to a good internship and then to an entry-level job, or maybe you got a journalism master's degree and that led to an entry-level job, and then you worked your way up through these different hierarchies, from smaller newspapers to larger ones, smaller magazines to larger ones, and so on. And there was a real intellectual consensus, I think, even if, it was sort of interwoven with this ideal of objectivity, but there was no question that the press as a whole tilted center-left, with some token conservatives and the occasional true left-winger, but basically the media establishment was committed to the premise that moderate Democrats and liberal Republicans were right about almost everything, and anyone who disagreed too much might be dangerously extreme. And finally, there was a real sense of mission. The press has always seen itself as a kind of extra branch of government. The term the fourth estate that gets used to describe journalism, and that I think I used in the title of this talk, dates back to the estates of pre-revolutionary France. There were three: the nobles, the clergy, and the commons, or maybe, depending on which etymology you believe, it dates back to a similar kind of estates model in Britain. But in either case, the term comes from the idea that journalists are a kind of political class unto themselves. So that's always been there. But in the second half of the 20th century, in the age of media consolidation and media giants, this sense of political mission was really heightened to the point where institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, and so on, I think sometimes saw themselves as a kind of extra Supreme Court, passing formal judgments on American politicians and American policies, and sometimes, as in the case of Watergate, even removing those politicians from office. And for Americans who grew up in that era, this was just normal. And the more freewheeling, partisan, sort of truthy media landscape of Mencken's era seemed like a strange and probably gone forever world. But now it looks increasingly as though the era of the media establishment was an aberration in American history, rather than sort of an inevitable result of progress, modernity, and all the rest. And it was created by a confluence of technological and economic trends that were temporary and which were already passing even before the internet came on the scene. So the fact that in the 50s and 60s, television was new and had only a few channels, and there was no cable, there was no proliferation of outlets. So it was possible to have a media establishment and a media consensus because you only had 3 nightly newscasts and so on. And at the same time, the economics of the newspaper business in the 70s, 80s, and so on incentivized the creation of local monopolies. So there would be one newspaper in a given city, and that newspaper would be immensely profitable and didn't really have to worry about competition so much, so it could afford to have a sort of establishment-y, sort of public-spirited mentality. And these trends coincided with the broader professionalization of American life, which made the era of journalism graduate schools and sort of journalism as a white-collar profession seem very, very natural. But all of that, or almost all of it, was actually temporary. And now that era is going or has already gone away. And I think in its place, we're entering an era that's more like the media era of Mencken's day and before. More competitive, more partisan, more sensationalistic, less hierarchical, less establishmentarian, less self-consciously public-spirited, less self-consciously serious. And this looks actually, I think, more like the kind of media that the United States had throughout most of its history. The media that gave us newspaper wars and press barons, party newspapers, and dubious journalistic ethics sometimes. In a sense, we're going back to the kind of hustling, dirt-dealing, source-greasing newspaper business that you can see immortalized in early 20th century movies about journalism, like The Front Page and His Girl Friday, rather than the more sort of self-serious media that was immortalized in All the President's Men, for instance. And this transformation has clearly changed the nature of journalistic careers, my own included. I don't think we're going back to the days when journalism was a completely blue-collar profession and most journalists lacked college degrees. College is too much a part of the credentialing process in American life for would-be journalists to skip it. But apart from the issue of education, other than that, the hierarchies that I just described, the whole work at this newspaper for 3 years, then there for 5, and maybe you can skip to the head of the line if you went to an Ivy League school and so on, these are being blown up completely. Stability in journalism, the kind of stability that people took for granted 20 and 30 years ago, is gone. And journalism is becoming much more of a hustle again. There was a time when it seemed like being a journalist was going to become like being a lawyer. You tried to get to a good firm, make partner, and then stay there for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Now it's much more like being a low-paid but ambitious consultant. You need to be prepared to jump from one publication to another, following the audience or following the money in some cases. You need to self-brand. You can't just tie yourself to these big institutions because you don't know if those institutions will be there forever. Though obviously, I hope the New York Times will be. Here are a couple typical careers, for instance, taken from my generation of journalists, the sort of under 35 group. There's a writer for the Washington Post, who some of you may have heard of, named Ezra Klein, who writes a very popular political blog and column and so on. And he came to Washington, D.C. from California. I think he went to UC Irvine and then UCLA. But he came to D.C. and got into political journalism before he'd finished graduating from college. He had started his own personal blog, and then he went to work for a liberal group blog. And then his blogging got him hired by a liberal political magazine, the American Prospect. And then that led to his being hired by the Washington Post. And now he's, I think, 25 or 26 years old, and one of the most important liberal writers, I would argue, and I think a lot of people would agree, in Washington, D.C., which is just astonishing compared to, similar career trajectories 20 or 30 years ago. That's one example. Another example is a woman named Elizabeth Spires, who just became editor of a paper called the New York Observer, which is a paper that covers media and celebrity and real estate in New York. She's, I think, in her mid-30s, a little bit older than me, and she started her career at Gawker, which is a sort of media gossip and news site that some of you guys may have heard of. And then she moved to another media site called Media Bistro, and then she helped found a media company that publishes a set of blogs and gossip sites that cover Wall Street, the law, the fashion industry, and so on. And now, by going to work for the New York Observer, here in her mid-30s, this is probably her first job with a kind of old media company, with the kind of place that lots of writers would have aspired to start their career 20 years ago or so. But it isn't just people in my own demographic. I could make a long list of older journalists, people who worked at places like Time and Newsweek and so on, who had jobs that, it seemed like places they would be forever, who have instead spent the last 5 or 10 years reinventing themselves repeatedly, sort of moving from place to place, instead of just spending years at the places where, again, an earlier generation of journalists would have stayed more or less forever. And so the nature of careers has changed, and the nature of publications has changed. And I think this usually gets understood by when people talk about the success of sort of explicitly partisan media, sort of left-wing and right-wing concerns like the Huffington Post on the one hand, Fox News on the other hand. And this sort of partisanization of media gets a lot of attention, and deservedly so. I think another important story, though, in a way, is the way that the media increasingly narrowcasts, you might say, targeting niche audiences, whether sort of geographically with like local blogs that cover local politics, sort of local news and so on, or a kind of journalism that, is catered to, video game obsessives or hockey fans or what have you. And it's this, in a sense, it's the same kind of thing that, major daily newspapers always did, but major dailies bundled it all together. So you got your sports pages and your real estate page and your local news, and if you got the New York Times but lived in Connecticut, there was a Connecticut section, and if you lived in New Jersey, it was the same thing, but it was all bundled together. And the story of media in the last 10 years is the story of, thanks to the internet, that all of that has been unbundled. And so now, I live in Washington, D.C., right? I get some of my local news from the Washington Post. Most of my local news, though, comes from a blogger who's known as the Prince of Petworth. Petworth is a sort of up-and-coming neighborhood in Northwest Washington. And, he runs a blog that covers basically the stuff that people who live in these particular neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. are concerned about, sort of zoning issues, restaurant openings, real estate prices, all the rest. And that's true in cities around the country. You have these niche blogs, niche publications catering to niche audiences that are spread out rather than bundled together into larger institutions. And I think, in a way, that maybe more than the sort of partisanization of media is the most important trend in the media landscape today, more important than the political side. But of course, everybody wants to talk about the political side, right? And everybody wants to know, well, what does this transformation in the media mean for American politics? And the easy answer, and the one that a lot of journalists will give to you, is that it's more or less dreadful. That the trends in media are going to give us a more dysfunctional and divided political system, and a public that doesn't know enough basic facts to do its democratic duty. And so this argument says, well, look, there won't be, in this new landscape, there won't be room for serious, long-form, thoughtful journalism anymore. Everybody's just going to be chasing the next sensational story that gets you the web traffic and the hits and so on. There won't be room, the large institutional papers like the New York Times, their profit margins were large enough that they could support, for instance, a well-staffed Baghdad bureau, right, during the Iraq War. That's a lot harder for an outlet like the Huffington Post to do. And certainly, the Prince of Petworth isn't going to set up a Baghdad bureau anytime soon. So those are the kind of things that people worry will go away and leave American democracy the poorer for it. And at the same time, people worry that the partisanship of the media, will, from MSNBC to Fox News to whatever, will feed increasing polarization and make the country less and less governable. And then I think people fear the rise of what, for want of a better word, I'll just call bullshit, right? This is the idea that you hear a lot from journalists, that blogs, they can just publish anything they want, right? And so obviously gossip, lies, and half-truths are going to win out over, real, serious, rigorous fact-check news. And at the same time, worthy causes in this hyper-commercialized landscape just aren't going to get the attention they deserve. And the commercial side of journalism will always trump the high-minded side. Everyone will write and read about real estate prices, and nobody will write about, say, prison reform. So that's sort of the worst case scenario. And I think that some of those fears are a little bit misplaced. I think that polarization in politics and media is a real problem. It's something we should all be concerned about because, it affects how people understand American politics. People see things through partisan prisms and don't see the complete truth, and it affects government in Washington, D.C. I'm not entirely sure, though, that a more polarized media is necessarily worse than the kind of sometimes suffocating blanket that a center-left establishment media could impose on political discourse, and did impose in certain ways in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Certainly, I don't think conservatives have any reason to be terribly nostalgic for the days when there were only 3 broadcast networks and so on. But I also think people on the left don't either. I think, if you go back to the 60s and 70s and look at some of the left-wing critiques that a figure like Noam Chomsky was making, right, of the sort of corporate side of the media, and the fact that these, all Americans were getting their news from a very few outlets that were all part of major corporations and so on. I think that critique had a lot of truth to it as well. And I think you can see the sort of, in the fragmentation of media, a chance for, a real diversity of competing voices to be heard that wasn't really possible 30 or 40 years ago and so on. I'm not a big fan of Fox News or the Huffington Post. I don't get most of my news from either of those sources. But in a way, taken together, those two media sources are truer to the realities of opinion in a vast, divided country than were, say, any of the old nightly news shows. They reveal America as it actually is, divided, argumentative, partisan, polarized, etc. And pretending that that kind of division doesn't exist doesn't necessarily make it go away. And I think you can see this if you look back on American politics in the 60s and 70s, right? That was the golden age of the journalistic establishment. It's not clear that it was a golden age of sort of, political comedy and consensus. I don't think that idea really stands up to scrutiny. By a lot of measures, American politics was much crazier in the 60s and 70s, even than it is today. Even in an age when you had sort of dominant big 3 networks and glossy magazines sort of trying to establish a consensus in American life, maybe it kept some of the craziness off the front pages and off the political talk shows, but the craziness just went on percolating in mimeographs and leaflets and conspiratorial paperbacks and so on. If you go back and read a book that I highly recommend to everybody, it's a book called Nixonland by Rick Perlstein, who's a liberal journalist writing about basically the period from 1964 to 73 in American life. Anytime you think to yourself, American politics is way too polarized and crazy right now, go read Nixonland. Go read about the level of paranoia and outright violence that defined American politics in the civil rights and Vietnam era. Sean Hannity and Keith Olbermann have nothing on the Weathermen and the KKK. And that world, a world where the media kind of refused to reflect America's real polarization, that was a world that produced more violence in a way, more assassinations. Whatever role our sort of fragmented, slightly crazy internet media culture played in, say, a tragedy like Jared Lee Loughner's shooting spree earlier this year, in the 1960s and 1970s, America seemed to be producing a new Jared Lee Loughner just about every month. So it isn't clear to me that the media establishment provided actually the kind of center that it aspired to provide. And I think the same goes to some extent, at least, for the idea that truth, capital T truth, is dying in the new media environment. There's no question that there are fewer controls on what gets published and by whom. But there are also advantages to this new model. The internet, with its myriad competing voices, is also a furious source of correction and contention. If you only write for 10 people, it's true, you can just spin crazy conspiracy theories and tell bald-faced lies, and your 10 readers will love you, and so on. But if you aspire to a wider audience, as most journalists do, you have to know that any time you really mangle the facts, there'll be some officious jerk in your comments section telling you why you're wrong, and there'll be 17 rival bloggers jumping down your throat. And yes, perhaps there is more room for sort of crazy theories to float around and get traction and so on, but there are also, I think, more opportunities to see conventional wisdom punctured than there used to be 20 or 30 years ago. And that has real value as well. And again, it's hard to find a lot of evidence that in the age of the media establishment, Americans were better educated about politics, more likely to know basic facts about government and so on, than they are today. Polls, if you poll people, you know, who is your senator, who signed the Declaration of Independence and so on, you can find an astonishing ignorance in the United States about what seem like very basic civic and political facts. But if you go back and look at similar polls from 30, 40, 50 years ago, that same ignorance was in evidence then as well. So those are that's sort of my pushback against some of the worst case scenarios. It doesn't mean, though, that there's nothing to worry about. I think the fear that certain kinds of journalism, really valuable kinds, are being lost is a more valid fear. And so is the problem of commercialism in journalism. One thing that I particularly worry about, this is maybe is an idiosyncratic fear, but I think one of the things you see is the disappearance of real regional journalism in the United States. In certain ways, national politics is being covered as never before. There are more jobs for people writing about national political campaigns than there were probably before the internet came on the scene. And the internet has a way of sort of nationalizing everything, right? Because everybody's on the internet. You can talk to a guy in Seattle, Washington as easily as you can talk to somebody in Provo. So that nationalization is real, and at the same time, there's probably more hyper-local coverage than ever before, right? Because people are always going to want some kind of journalism that focuses on their school district, right? Their neighborhood, their local government, and so on. What's being squeezed, I think, is sort of the mid-sized daily newspaper, newspapers like the Baltimore Sun, where Mencken worked and actually where my wife worked for a while, and sort of regional identities, the idea of like a Midwestern media culture, a Mountain West media culture, and so on. And I think that's dangerous in a couple ways. I think it's dangerous because it means that, for instance, maybe there's less scrutiny on state governments and state capitals than they should be, right? Because everybody cares about what's happening in Washington, and they care about what's happening down the street, but they don't see the importance of what's happening, in whatever their state capital happens to be. But I also think that in the current environment, America could actually kind of benefit from a greater regionalism in our politics and culture. I think it would actually help with polarization in American life if there was more of a sense of like, let the Northeast be the Northeast and the South be the South, let Utah be Utah and Massachusetts be Massachusetts and so on, instead of immediately nationalizing every issue and debate. And I think the contemporary media culture pushes against that, pushes towards nationalization in ways that are unhealthy. And the problem of commercialism is unquestionably real. I think you can be too nostalgic and sort of overestimate how many people actually read, say, a big series that a newspaper ran on prison reform, right, in 1975. Like, then as now, if you publish a serious, high-minded thumbsucker on an issue that a lot of people don't want to read about, they aren't going to read it. But there clearly, I think, was a value to the way the old bundled model of news forced people to at least see things they didn't necessarily want to see. Even if you were only reading the paper for the sports section, you still had to flip by the front page with the story on something happening overseas or something happening in your community and so on. And now that's just not as true. If you want to read about sports, you can read ESPN.com, or you can read your favorite baseball blogger like I do, and you don't have to confront anything outside of that comfort zone. And I think that to some extent this problem can be addressed by public interest journalism. There are a lot of nonprofit foundations and so on that sponsor, serious, high-minded, non-commercial journalism, but you still have the problem of getting people to read it. And I think that problem will only get worse. And finally, I worry about a particular kind of storytelling, the long-form narrative piece, the unexpectedly interesting essay, the sort of off-the-news feature that really thrived in newspapers and magazines and is a tougher sell in the age of the internet. And here I think I have a certain amount of personal techno-pessimism. I think a lot of my peers and many of my dear friends are convinced that the internet is putting us through a cultural revolution that's on par with the invention of the printing press, and that life on the internet will be culturally innovative and fertile in ways we're only just beginning to understand. And I like to think that's true, but I also often incline in a more pessimistic direction, and it seems to me that sort of internet culture and the way it affects the media is the enemy, really, of literary craft and intellectual depth. And if you're an aspiring writer who wants to be more than just a blogger or, God help you, a columnist, you might be well served to rip your internet cable out of the wall right now and just read books. So that's sort of one of the worries that I carry with me in the media today. But I think I should return to where I began to conclude with H.L. Mencken, because I wonder if Mencken, if he were here today, might say that, yes, that kind of worry is all well and good, but it isn't really the business of journalism, ultimately, to cultivate the next great philosopher or novelist. It's the business of journalism, right, to go out and grab the world by the lapels and drag it into the reader or viewer's living room. Nothing more, nothing less. And so with that in mind, I want to end with two sort of upbeat quotations. One is from a great essay that was published recently in The Atlantic, my old employer, by Jim Fallows, that I think makes, if you read the essay, you'll note many similarities between his arguments and the arguments I've made today, because I've been borrowing from him to some extent. But the essay is entitled "Learning to Love the Shallow, Divisive, Unreliable New Media." And Fallows at one point talks about the current crises in the Middle East, right? And he says, look, this is exactly the kind of situation where you would expect the current journalistic culture to be kind of a disaster, right? Because all these newspapers have had to close their foreign bureaus. People don't care enough about what's happening overseas. So surely, the upheavals in Egypt and Libya and elsewhere won't be covered as well as they were 20 years ago. But in fact, he says, if you look at the actual coverage, and this is the quote, a major event in world history was covered more quickly, with more nuance, involving a greater range of voices and critical perspectives than would have been conceivable even a few years ago. Within hours of the first protests in Egypt, American and world audience read dispatches from professional correspondents on websites rather than waiting till the next day, as they had during, say, the fall of the Berlin Wall. They saw TV news footage, including Al Jazeera's, which was carried by few U.S. broadcasters, but was available on computers and mobile apps. And then the Twitter feeds from Egypt, the amateur YouTube videos from the street, the commentary of contending analysts, all of it available as the story took place. We take this for granted, yet there has been nothing like it before. Even a year ago, it would have been hard to imagine how thoroughly and with what combination of media, voices, and judgment an event in an Arab capital could have been witnessed around the world. And I think Fallows is right about that. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind. And I'll end with a quote from Mencken himself, because you have to quote Mencken if you talk about him. And he's talking about his initial experiences in journalism and why they were so wonderful. And he says, at a time when the respectable bourgeois youngsters of my generation were college freshmen, oppressed by simian sophomores, and affronted with balderdash daily and hourly by chalky pedagogues, I was at large in a wicked seaport of 500,000 people, with a front seat at every public show, as free of the night as of the day, and getting earfuls and eyefuls of instruction in 100 giddy arcana, none of them taught in schools. On my 21st birthday, by all orthodox cultural standards, I probably reached my all-time low, for the heavy reading of my teens had been abandoned in favor of life itself, and I did not return seriously to the lamp until a time near the end of this record. But it would be an exaggeration to say that I was ignorant, for if I neglected the humanities, I was meanwhile layering in all the worldly wisdom of a police lieutenant, a bartender, a shyster lawyer, or a midwife. And so when I want to feel optimistic about the future of the media, I try to think that we may be very lucky and see an age that promises a few more Mencken's, in which case it won't be all that bad. Thank you very much. And I see there's a mic, so I assume that people should line up at the mic if you have questions. Yes?
We're recording this, so if you could kindly speak into the mic. President Holland is an avid reader of Ross's, and he is in China right now. So he would like to hear all of the comments and goings on here. So we have 35 minutes for open questions and discussion, so please step up to the mic.
And you can ask me about anything. You don't have to ask me about the future of the media. I mean, you can ask me about that, obviously. But.
I forewarn you, this is Phil Gordon, professor of communication and
All right, I'm ready.
I'll go light on you, but if nobody gets behind me, it's going to get heavy.
You can take the mic out of the stand too. We can.
That's all right. I project. First, I'll ask: will there always be a New York Times?
Yes.
Are
Should
they-
I can elaborate.
I'm just looking at they keep changing their strategy with regard to their online marketing and stuff like that. Are they nervous over there, or are they one of the papers that?
All is well with the New York Times. Our profits continue to soar, and I see no trouble on the horizon. Thank you. No, no. I mean, look. There's a big debate within every newspaper, but that has now reached the Times about whether to charge for online content and how to sort of take all the web traffic and turn it into money that can pay salaries and staff Baghdad bureaus and so on. And right now, the Times has embarked on a paywall experiment that's only a couple weeks old, I think, so it's too soon to know how it's going to go, but where they're, for the first time, really trying to charge people past a certain point and with all sorts of ways to get through and so on, but charge people for content online. And obviously, as an employee of the New York Times and a fan of serious journalism, I hope that effort succeeds, because there has to be a way in the end for publications to make money on the internet and make somewhat more than they could make today. So that's sort of the immediate challenge, and then there are all sorts of challenges ahead, even for a paper like the Times. And I cannot tell you that the Times will not change, in certain ways, or that things may happen that readers of the may make readers of the Times unhappy. I wish I could promise that. Maybe I should promise that in case my employers are watching this. But what I do think, though, is that papers like the Times are in a much better position overall than any other newspaper, because I think a lot of the trends I was talking about, nationalization, for instance, right? I do think America is moving towards a newspaper model that's more like Britain's, right? In Britain, sort of local and mid-sized cities do not have a really strong tradition of journalism. What you have instead is 4 or 5 or 6 national newspapers that are all sort of pan-British and all compete for not necessarily the same readership. Some lean conservative, some lean liberal, and so on. But that's where I think we're going more and more in the United States, that you have sort of the papers that have more trouble are papers like the Boston Globe, the Baltimore Sun, the Dallas Morning News, and so on. And papers like the Times and the Wall Street Journal, and to a lesser extent USA Today and the Washington Post and so on, can find an identity and an audience from this new national or even international audience. So I think in that sense, yeah, I think the Times will, I mean, always is a long time, but I would have a lot of confidence in the Times' staying power.
I'll just do a follow-up.
Yeah,
You know, when Doris Kearns Goodwin was here a couple months ago, and she actually made the opposite argument that you're making right now. She said it's never been more polarized. She blames when she's talking about political polarization, she says right there in Congress and Senate, she's never witnessed in all her decades less communication across the aisle.
Yep.
She totally diagnosed news media and the sort of ghettoization of news on the internet as being part of the problem. She was actually kind of pessimistic about her about her sense of America to be able to actually face problems and solve them, because nobody talks to each other anymore and listens to each other anymore. There's a sort of obliteration of certain histories, and like her, and I heard you sort of equating Fox News with the Huffington Post, and you're right that they both have a certain political agenda. I'd certainly agree with you there, although I do believe that the Huffington Post sticks to saying things that are true, whereas the Fox News is basically a disinformation machine that is an unapologetic mouthpiece for the Republican Party, whereas the Huffington Post will still at least hold Democrats responsible for their actions. Can you respond to that? Maybe I'll sit down.
I mean, I might actually pass on the Fox News versus Huffington Post question. I think that on the broader question of polarization, Goodwin is right that the Congress of the United States has never been more polarized, in the sense that, or never, in the last 75 years, let's say, the Congress of the United States has never been more polarized, in the sense that the two parties are more ideologically coherent than at any point in modern American history. So it used to be that when you said Democrat, you didn't necessarily mean liberal, right? There were lots of conservative Democrats, and the same was true with Republicans. There were lots of liberal Republicans, right? And the two parties were both sort of ideologically diverse coalitions. And that made bipartisanship easier, right? Because, liberal Republicans could work with moderate Democrats, and conservative Democrats could work with conservative Republicans, and so on. And there were real advantages to that. The art of deal making was probably stronger in Washington in the 1960s than it is today. The flip side of that, though, is that it's not clear that the country as a whole is more polarized today than it was in the 1960s. It may be more polarized in the sense that people are more likely to identify with the Republican team or the Democratic team. But in terms of like the gulf separating a conservative Republican from a liberal Democrat, right? 1957, a conservative Democrat in the South believed in a system of racial apartheid. And this was not a mainstream position nationally, but this was a mainstream and respectable position in the southern states of the United States. Today, they're obviously there are still sort of regional eccentricities, and Haley Barbour, the Republican governor of Mississippi, is thinking of running for president, and it recently made big news when he said that he thought, slavery was the cause of the Civil War and that it was good that the South lost. This was like a big thing for a governor of Mississippi to say. So obviously, that the realities of the 1950s echo today, but I think it can be a mistake to sort of regard the sort of age of perfect consensus that supposedly existed in the 50s and 60s as this sort of golden time in American life. I mean, the old Democratic majority, right, the New Deal majority that Goodwin has written so much about, was forged by an alliance between liberal Northern Democrats and conservative Southern Democrats, where the price of the New Deal was basically that liberal Democrats agreed not to do anything about segregation for 25 or 30 years. And the fact that today the parties are more ideologically coherent means that it can be harder to get deals done in Washington, but it also means that, if you're a liberal and you vote for the Democrats, you don't have to worry that you're empowering Strom Thurmond, right? And the same is true on the Republican side. You don't have to worry, as a lot of conservative Republicans did in the early 60s, that they were going to vote for Nelson Rockefeller, and it was just the same as voting for a Democrat. So I think there are lots of reasons for pessimism. I agree, and I live in Washington, D.C. I know there are lots of reasons for pessimism, and there are lots of reasons why it may be that on the bigger challenges facing the U.S., polarization will make it hard to make the necessary deals. But I also think that we need to recognize that there are advantages as well as disadvantages in the current era, and just saying that, saying that, well, it would be good if we had, and you're probably not saying this, right? As an avid reader of the Huffington Post, you probably don't think it would be great if we just had a centrist elite, right, making all these decisions, right? But that was sort of the ideal of the 50s and 60s, right? That we could have this sort of managerial elite that was sort of on the center left and was sort of technocratic and could fiddle with things, and and things would work out for the best. And I look at America today, and I think that to the extent that we have a centrist elite, right, it's sort of socially liberal, Wall Street Democrats, right? Let's say that's the centrist elite. I'm not really impressed with the job that centrist elite has done over the past 10 or 15 years, and I think that just sort of aspiring to have that kind of elite sort of pushing, Glenn Beck and his viewers, or Keith Olbermann and his viewers to the sidelines, it creates problems of its own. So that's my case for optimism, I guess.
I'd stay up here, but now finally there's a line. So thanks for entertaining.
Yeah. Well, you can come back. You can if you just circle around. You might even.
Hey, first off, thanks for coming, Ross. We're really glad to have you here at UVU. I have two questions. One is more about the strategy of the New York Times media, especially with the web and mobile apps. As students, we do get a discount with our paper here at UVU with the New York Times, and we really appreciate that. But is there any strategy or possible strategies that could be made to have a discount on mobile applications and or web?
I don't know.
Okay.
I
kind of knew that was a shot in the dark.
Well, it's just there is both a bright line drawn between the editorial and business side of the Times to the where I knew basically as little about the paywall as anyone in this room before the paywall was announced. I knew they were working on it, but I didn't know what the nature of the discussions was. And then I'm in Washington and the paper's in New York. I'm not, I'm just not the guy to give you the sort of inside corporate,
The other question is I kind of feel like with journalism, we're going into more of a journalism 2.0 era. And having said that, how can we as students, and what else can you give to us or suggest to the students to make that transition easier? And I feel like you've done a lot. You've said a lot of things.
Well, right. So I was talking to some people from your fine campus newspaper beforehand, and we were talking about one of the pieces of advice that young journalists get all the time now is that you need to know how to wear a lot of hats, right? So you need to be comfortable, being a reporter and a blogger, and maybe knowing how to work a video camera and edit web video and so on. So that's sort of the cliched advice, right? And it's true. It's cliched for a reason, because we're in an age when even the oldest and most established journalists find themselves suddenly working for the Huffington Post, right? Like the head of Huffington Post political coverage is Howard Feynman. Howard Feynman is like the epitome of a sort of inside, pre-internet Washington journalist, and now he is, running part of the Huffington Post. It's something that would have been unimaginable 5 or 6 years ago. And if those kind of transitions are being made by people who are sort of well established in their careers, for younger journalists, there's every reason to just be, you just need to be open. If you're trying to get your foot in the door in journalism and there's a job for a, web video producer and you would rather write, it's not the worst thing in the world to know how to produce web video and get that job. So that conventional wisdom is all true. The other thing, though, that I said to people earlier, that lesson can be taken too far, right? Like, people go into journalism because they want to do particular things, because they want to be a reporter who, can travel to Afghanistan and write about it, because they want to be a writer and a wordsmith like Mencken, because they want to be, the photographer taking the pictures of the war zone in Africa. And journalism is it's always been a sort of hustling profession, never been that well paid and so on, but now more than ever, it's a tough, highly competitive, hustling profession. And if people should do it in order to do the thing they want to do, right? So if you spend 5 years in journalism and you're spending those 5 years as a web producer, but you hate being a web producer and you really want to be a writer, then it's not worth it ultimately. So I think that my caveat to that advice is you can take the sort of wear a million hats a little bit too far sometimes, and it's important, sometimes you're just trying to wear one hat, and, you should wear it well, I guess.
Actually, I thought of one more question.
Yeah. There are only two people behind you.
Oh,
They look very
okay,
patient.
they look really patient. I'm really sorry. If you could recommend one book about the media and more concerning new media, what book would you suggest?
New media book. You understand that those two things do not go together. And I'm actually being perfectly serious. A book about the new media. Because there were a bunch of, so when blogs came on the scene, there were a bunch of books about like blogs, right, and how they're sort of changing the world and so on. But those books about blogging tend to be bad books. It's sort of like, dancing about architecture. So no, it's sort of like a mismatch. Let me try and, there are sort of archetypal books about journalism, like The Boys on the Bus, right? These sort of books about what it's like to cover a presidential campaign and so on. But, my general advice to people is if you're interested in new media, you should just read a lot of new media rather than, there isn't sort of a, this is new media. But I'll try and think during the remainder of the time. Maybe I'll come up with something.
Thank you for coming to UVU. I had two questions that are wildly unrelated. The first is, in talking about having to post Fox News, how much do you think that is? I missed the first 20 minutes or so I was in class, so I apologize if you.
That was the
addressed
good
this.
part.
Yeah.
It was all downhill.
How much do you think that is a new development? How much of that is just kind of the cyclic coming from yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst, and is at some point going to continue on to more or slightly less politicized media?
Well, I guess the argument that I made in the first part was that it is a return to that older model, but that there's good reason to think that the sort of serious establishment, sort of what you might call the consolidated media of the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a historical aberration that was unsustainable. And so I think that there is lots of room for sort of web journalism to develop and become more serious, and I think you can already see it happening in a lot of places as people sort of gradually figure out how to do more serious journalism on the web. I just don't think the age where every city has one daily newspaper and that's what everybody is reading in that city is ever coming back. And I think it's easy. I've been talking mainly about print, but this is really easy to see with television, right? That one of the reasons you had a sort of this sort of serious establishment tone in television for a long time, because you had four or five, six television channels, and you could have something like, the fairness doctrine, right? These things that sort of conservatives are always terrified that liberals are going to bring back, right? That you can't have talk radio because you'd have to have equal time and so on. Those things are never coming back. They're relics of a different technological moment. And as far as I can tell, every technological change since 1957 or so has just been towards fragmentation and diversity. So the trick, I think, is to find ways to do the seriousness within the sort of more partisan, sort of sensationalistic world, rather than dream of bringing back the days when everybody was watching either Ted Koppel or Peter Jennings or whoever.
And then my second question is, do you feel that in today's, especially print media, especially with newspapers, are AP and Reuters becoming, quote unquote, too big to fail? That in some sense that by being the clearinghouses for so much information that smaller newspapers get, that they do open themselves up for attacks on on having an agenda.
That's a really interesting idea. I actually hadn't really thought about that point. I mean, I think that the idea, the complaints about media institutions having an agenda have, I mean, if you go back 20 or 30 years, it's not, the complaints about, for instance, how Reuters covers the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? There's a lot of complaints about that. That is not new. I mean, it may be heightened by the fact that so many smaller newspapers have to get their news from Reuters in a way that they didn't before, and it may be true that sort of brings, it brings more readers in contact with it. I mean, I think you could see a flip side where the fact that Reuters, has relationships with so many papers and so on actually creates a sort of, that Reuters and AP become sort of the last bastion of more self-consciously objective style, because they are the people who are sort of pumping stuff into newspapers and liberal communities and newspapers and conservative communities and so on. But I do think that the too big to fail point is also probably true, that, you have, I mean, I think one of the interesting questions is just, and I don't think we know this yet because the generation that came of age with the internet is still a relatively small fraction of the U.S. But where I mean, I had that long quote from Fallows at the end of the piece. It would be interesting to know, like, okay, so we have this amazing sort of media coverage of the Middle East, right? But how many people are actually how many readers are participating in that amazing coverage versus, and I've seen statistics that say, for instance, that of people getting their news off the web, a huge percentage, it's just CNN.com. Right, because that's all they know. It's like the same as on your television set, right? You just go to CNN.com. And I think the interesting question that we don't know yet is when the sort of internet generations come of age in 30 or 40 years, will CNN.com still sort of matter? Will there still be those clearinghouses, or will more people, I guess, get their news the way I get my news, right? Like, I am a total, I have 6 blogs that link to 6 other blogs, and they link to YouTube videos, and I read Twitter feeds, God help me, and, all of that. Is that something that will happen on a mass scale, or will there always be a need for some clearinghouse? And I don't know the answer to that. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
In the past 1 or 2 years, CNN replaced Ludov, and MSNBC replaced Keith Olbermann, and recently Fox News terminated Glenn Beck. And these people are money makers, and also they represent the polarization. Do you think the main media are trying to bring back the polarization?
No, not as a whole, but I think the examples you cite are suggestive insofar as, so by getting rid of Keith Olbermann, MSNBC did not abandon, I think, its quest to sort of brand itself as the liberal network. What they did, though, what I believe, and it's just me speculating, but what I think the MSNBC theory was that a figure like Olbermann, who was sort of over-the-top, controversial, difficult to work with, expensive, and so on, was necessary to establish MSNBC's brand as sort of a liberal alternative to Fox. But with that brand established, you don't need sort of the sort of loose cannon-y, expensive, difficult figure. You can put somebody else in that slot. You can put Lawrence O'Donnell in, who's just as liberal as Keith Olbermann, but doesn't give you as many headaches, right? And I think you can see a similar dynamic with Glenn Beck and Fox News, right? Like, Fox News basically made a kind of devil's bargain with Beck, where it was like, you're going to get us these incredible ratings for a short period of time, but you're also going to undercut and, believe it or not, there are many people who work at Fox who consider themselves, in spite of, in spite of the liberal perspective on the network, who say, no, we do a lot of serious news coverage and we have opinion as well. But, Glenn Beck didn't have that many fans in the corridors of Fox News. And so I think it was a similar thing where at a certain point it was like, all right, your ratings are going down, this sort of Glenn Beck moment in American politics has passed, so we're going to cut our ties to you. So in that sense, I think, and CNN and Lou Dobbs, his ratings weren't that great, I think, but when he was pushed out. But in that sense, these networks, these sort of are still, for all the fragmentation and so on, are still big corporate entities and still do sort of, they don't want to be held hostage to sort of very particular performers, you might say, and figures like that. But I don't think that means that like Fox News is ever going to abandon its branding as a right of center network, or MSNBC the same thing. I do think the danger with the networks is, and I think that this is that it does, it would be, Fox News would be a better network if it was a conservative network that had a somewhat more diverse set of conservative views. So like, there are people, there's a danger of sort of, you start out saying, well, we're going to have these partisan networks, but they're going to give us a greater diversity, right, than the old establishment media. But then if your partisan network just does sound like a mouthpiece for the Republican Party, you haven't achieved anything in the way of diversity. And I think that's, if Ron Paul hosted a 9 p.m. show on Fox, Fox would be a better network than it is with Sean Hannity hosting a show, because that Sean Hannity is just going to do a show where Democrats are evil and Republicans are awesome. Whereas, Ron Paul, who is to the right of Sean Hannity, might not be a good television host, but you take my point. So that's I think one of the, and cable news is just an awful medium in general. I mean, it's awful. I find it awful to watch. It's even more awful to appear on, because it exists to get people to shout at each other. So you will get a call from a cable news channel. I don't get very many calls from Fox, right? Because I'm a New York Times conservative. They don't need New York Times conservatives on Fox. But I get calls from other networks, and it's always like, well, what's your opinion on this issue of the day? And I say, well, here's my opinion. And they're like, oh, well, that's not really strident enough for us. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but that's sort of the mentality. And so, yeah. Anyway, yes.
I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about your book that either was just printed or is upcoming in relation to kind of the topic with journalism and the change in journalism.
My book about the Republican Party, or my
Yes.
book about Harvard? Republican Party?
Yeah.
So my book about the Republican Party came out 2 years ago it was co-written with a friend of mine named Reihan Salam, and it was written in a very different era, sort of before the financial crisis, when America seemed to have money and things like that. So it made a bunch of policy prescriptions, basically, for the right, many of which are sort of unimaginable today, because the only questions facing us at the moment are how we're going to afford the commitments we have now. But basically, the argument of the book was that, that the Republican Party historically had succeeded in the Reagan era and afterwards by addressing itself to sort of immediate middle class and working class anxieties, and had failed to the extent late in the Bush era, especially, that it had sort of moved away from those anxieties to focus on things that the mass of Americans didn't really care about. So, if you look at the late in the Bush era, I mean, healthcare, for instance, was a huge source of anxiety then as it is today, and the Republican Party didn't really have anything to say about healthcare and so on. And so you could sort of go down that list. And so the book sort of went down that list and sort of tried to propose constructive policy ideas within a sort of limited government framework that would address themselves to working and middle class anxieties. My sense today, and this actually doesn't really, I'm having trouble relating this to the subject of the talk. So, but my sense today is that I think that same vision is necessary for conservatism. But we're operating in a different fiscal environment, and so the question is less, what do you spend money on, than how do you trim government in ways that, still promote opportunity and upward mobility, because I think America has more of a problem with economic opportunity and upward mobility than a lot of Republicans would like to admit. But how that relates to the current media environment, I'm not sure. Yes, you're back. Excellent.
Speaking
Huffington
of,
Post, a fine
no, I was going to
publication.
say, speaking of Republicans and fiscal policy,
Yes.
can you believe how the Republicans are cynically manipulating this financial crisis to push their anti-woman, anti-poor agendas down our back and acting like it's an emergency and we have to cut all this social spending, when really what we need is massive investment from the federal government to create jobs and help develop a sustainable infrastructure for the future?
I like how you phrased that. The "can I believe" enables me to answer, so I can just say yes and just leave it at that. No, wait, where'd you go? Do you want to have? I mean, we can go back and forth. I mean, I think that, I think the problem for liberalism, right, is that it has an economic diagnosis that's politically unrealistic, right? The liberal argument is basically that we had this enormous stimulus plan, but its enormity was insufficient to deal with the enormity of the crisis, and so you need to have another enormous stimulus plan, et cetera, ad infinitum. And it reminds me of the argument that some of my neoconservative friends made about the invasion of Iraq, which was basically that the invasion of Iraq went badly because we went in with 150,000 troops, and we really needed to go in with 600,000 troops. And this may be true as a matter, the sort of Keynesian argument might be true as sort of policy in an abstract imaginary world where governments don't ever worry about the consequences of deficits, in the same way that the neoconservative argument might have been true in an imaginary world where we'd instituted a draft after 9/11. But in the actual world we live in, I think that I think liberals need to come to grips with the fact that the idea that we're going to have stimulus packages without end until unemployment goes down to 4% and not worry about the fact that our debt is approaching a 90% threshold at which things historically have tended to go fairly badly for economies overall is a little bit unreasonable. So that would be, I think that we're in a really difficult situation where we have the danger of a looming debt crisis and current massive economic pain. And threading that needle is incredibly hard, and I certainly don't think that the sort of Republican answer of just cut is necessarily the best way to go. But I think there's a lot of political unreasonability in some of the arguments made by my dear colleague Paul Krugman, among others, about how Obama just needs to go out there and say, we need to spend. I mean, if you look at the deficit numbers, it's pretty incredible where we are already and where we're going. And where Republicans are coming from on this is basically just the idea, and this is not just a conservative idea. This is something I've heard from people who used to work in the Obama White House, which is that you can have it. The problem is you can say, well, interest rates are low and we're in no danger of a debt crisis, but the nature of debt crises is that they happen suddenly, much like the financial crisis happened before. So in theory, a responsible government would try and get out ahead of them, and I think that that's the best side of what Republicans are trying to do now, which is sort of propose long-term fiscal blueprints that sort of give the markets confidence that we're actually going to do something about our debt, because a debt crisis would be a much worse economic disaster than anything we've experienced so far.
Well, yeah, but the question is, where do you cut the debt and who suffers? And the fact is we've got shrinking middle class, increasing gap between the super rich and the rest of us, massive tax cuts for the super rich, all kinds of tax loopholes for the big corporations, and all they're talking about is how much are we going to cut out of Medicare and other sorts of social welfare programs, targeting the weakest, most vulnerable, most needy members of our society, and letting the robber barons and the corporations basically bleed this country dry and export all the dollars that they've stolen from us. I mean, we can't even get a new tax on the top 1% who can afford it very well. Not to mention the fact that nobody, including really the Democrats, are talking about where the real money goes, which is the overblown defense budget. And I would have to bring into that the New York Times' own culpability in that, as they apologized a few years after the Iraq War for misleading the American people about the Bush administration's justifications for going into that war in the first place.
I think you should keep in mind that not all entitlement cuts have to fall on the most vulnerable Americans. It's the nature of entitlement programs. The very term entitlement suggests the fact that, you know, wealthy senior citizens get Social Security checks and wealthy senior citizens get Medicare. And it's possible to imagine a reform of the entitlement system that, you know, essentially means-tested those programs in ways that preserve them as a safety net for the poor and most vulnerable, while, you know, I mean, ultimately something has to be done. You know, you cannot pay for the projected costs of Medicare simply by raising taxes on the rich. Some kind of reform of Medicare is necessary, and you can. I would agree that some of the cuts that, for instance, Paul Ryan's budget, right, this week has proposed to Medicare are ultimately politically unrealistic, and they would end up impacting low-income seniors probably too much. But I think the overall design of the Republican proposals, which basically tries to means test these programs and sort of establish different levels of government support for the poor, the middle class, and the rich, is actually totally reasonable and is reasonably consonant with progressive principles. So I think there may be more room for compromise on the one hand and for budget balancing that doesn't just involve cutting services for the poorest and most vulnerable. I do think that, you know, there's all kinds of stuff in our tax code that primarily benefits the well-off that can be pared down and should be. And I think, again, if you look at, you know, some of the proposals in, for instance, the bipartisan, we're emptying the room with this conversation, which is, and this gentleman in the front row looks like you should, no, you gotta go. Yeah, you gotta go, go, you've got class. Go, class is more important. No, it's not. No, but look, the Bowles-Simpson deficit proposal, right, which you, sir, probably think is an unconscionable right-wing sellout in the guise of a centrist alternative, proposed cutting down this thicket of tax loopholes and exemptions that primarily benefit the upper middle class. Something like the home mortgage deduction, right? A huge percentage of the home mortgage deduction goes to benefit upper middle class and wealthy homeowners because their homes are worth so much. And so again, there are places where I think where limited government deficit cutting is more consonant with egalitarianism than maybe you're willing to admit. Maybe, or maybe not.